Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The air in a pediatric intensive care unit is a unique blend of antiseptic sterility and palpable hope. It is a world shrunken down to the rhythmic, metronomic beeping of monitors, the soft, mechanical hiss of ventilators, and the hushed, urgent whispers of medical staff navigating a landscape of immense fragility. It smells of rubbing alcohol and bleached linen, a scent that tries but fails to mask the underlying primal aroma of illness. Here, life is measured in milliliters and heartbeats per minute, tracked on glowing screens that translate the body's secret language into waves and numbers. The patients are impossibly small, their tiny bodies entangled in a delicate web of wires and tubes, each one a testament to their precarious hold on life. It is a place of constant, low-grade tension, a frontier where the battle between medicine and mortality is waged every second, in every crib. In this crucible of stress and science, nurses are the sentinels. They are the frontline observers, the caregivers, the ones who stand watch through the long, quiet hours of the night when parents are forced to go home and rest. They are expected to be beacons of calm, competence, and above all, compassion. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, at the Bexar County Medical Center in San Antonio, Texas, one nurse seemed to embody this ideal more than any other. Her name was Genene Jones. To many of the frantic parents and overwhelmed young doctors, she was a godsend. She was a physically imposing woman, not tall but sturdy, with a helmet of blonde hair and a confident, almost brazen demeanor. When a tiny heart would suddenly falter or a baby's breathing would inexplicably cease, Genene was often the first to notice, the first to act. She moved with a practiced, confident urgency, a whirlwind of efficiency in the face of chaos. She was the one who could find a vein on a premature infant when no one else could, earning her the moniker of a vascular virtuoso. She was the one who seemed to know the precise dosage of epinephrine needed to restart a failing heart, the one who never panicked when the terrifying code blue alarm blared through the PICU, signifying a pediatric cardiac arrest. On the contrary, she seemed to thrive on it. While others were paralyzed by adrenaline and fear, Genene Jones was invariably at the center of the storm, seemingly pulling a child back from the very brink of death. She was praised by physicians for her quick thinking, her dedication, her almost supernatural ability to be in the right place at the right time. But underneath the surface of this heroic narrative, a darker, more insidious pattern was beginning to emerge, one that was almost too monstrous to comprehend. The coincidences started to pile up, forming a statistical mountain that became impossible for the observant to ignore. The codes, the sudden medical emergencies, the inexplicable seizures, they all seemed to happen with an alarming, almost predictable frequency during a specific window of time. The 3 to 11 p.m. shift. Genene Jones's shift. Children who were stable, some on the verge of being discharged, would suddenly crash without any warning. They would begin to bleed from old puncture wounds. Their muscles would go limp, as if their skeletons had dissolved. Their lungs would inexplicably fill with fluid. And Genene was always there. At first it was dismissed as a grim statistical anomaly. Some of her colleagues, steeped in the superstitions that haunt high-stress professions, morbidly dubbed it the death shift. But a few of her fellow nurses, and one particularly astute physician, began to feel a creeping, sickening sense of dread. The emergencies felt manufactured. The crises seemed to appear out of thin air, only to be heroically, and often successfully, resolved by the very person who was always on the scene, The praise she received after these events was effusive, and she seemed to bask in it. A horrifying question began to form in the minds of a few brave staff members, a question so profoundly disturbing it challenged the very foundation of their profession, the Hippocratic oath itself. What if the angel of mercy was, in fact, an angel of death? What if the person fighting so valiantly to save these children was the very reason they were dying in the first place? This possibility was so unthinkable, so contrary to the sacred trust placed in a caregiver, that it was almost easier to believe in a curse than in a killer wearing a nurse's uniform and a reassuring smile. Today, on Anatomy of Crime, we dissect the anatomy of medical murder. We will explore the chilling psychology of a disorder that turns a healer into a predator, creating a theater of crisis where they can star as the hero, and we will unravel the catastrophic institutional failures, the fear, the denial, and the bureaucracy that allowed Nurse Genene Jones to turn hospital wards into her private hunting grounds, leaving a trail of tiny graves that stretched across Texas for nearly a decade. To understand the woman who would become one of history's most infamous medical serial killers, we must first look at the life that shaped her. Genene Jones was born in Texas in 1950 and was adopted within a few months by a nightclub owner named Dick Jones and his wife, a beautician named Gladys. By all accounts, it was a stable middle-class home, but from an early age, Genene exhibited a desperate, almost pathological need for attention. She was a compulsive liar, but her lies were not small fibs to avoid trouble. They were elaborate, dramatic fictions designed to manipulate the perceptions of those around her, to garner sympathy and admiration through fabricated hardship and heroism. She would tell classmates that she was a Native American princess, or that she was secretly related to famous people. It was more than just childish fantasy. It was an early sign of a personality that needed to constantly reinvent reality to place herself at its center. This tendency was cemented by a real-life tragedy that struck the family when Genene was a teenager. Her 14-year-old adoptive brother, Travis, was killed in a bizarre explosion in the family's garage. He and a friend had been tinkering with a homemade pipe bomb when it detonated prematurely. The event was devastating for the family, but for Genene, it became a cornerstone of her personal mythology. In the aftermath, she told different conflicting stories about her role in the tragedy. In one version, she was the first on the scene, heroically trying to save her brother's life. In another, she was the one who discovered the grisly scene. She seemed to be testing which narrative elicited the strongest emotional response from her audience. The real trauma of her brother's death taught her a powerful and dark lesson. Proximity to crisis and death made you significant. It made people listen. As a young woman, she followed in her mother's footsteps and became a beautician. It was a profession that allowed her to be the center of her clients' attention, to listen to their stories and offer her own, often embellished, tales. In return, her personal life was a landscape of constant drama. She married her high school sweetheart, Jimmy Howell, and they had a son together. But the marriage was tumultuous and short-lived. She would go on to marry and divorce several more times, leaving a string of volatile relationships in her wake. One husband, from whom she was briefly estranged, shot himself in the chest after an argument with her. He survived, but the event became another dramatic story she would tell, another piece of evidence of the constant turmoil that seemed to follow her. She craved the spotlight, and when life didn't provide a crisis for her to manage, she would invent one. In the mid-1970s, seeking a more stable and respected career, Genene decided to become a nurse. On the surface, it was an admirable choice, but for someone with her psychological makeup, a hospital offered a perfect and terrifying opportunity. It was a place of inherent drama, an environment where life and death were daily occurrences. It offered a position of immense power and trust, and unparalleled access to the most vulnerable among us. She enrolled in the nursing program at the Brackenridge Hospital School of Nursing in Austin, Texas, graduating in 1977 as a licensed vocational nurse, or LVN. Soon after, she found the position that would become her killing field, the newly opened pediatric intensive care unit at Bexar County Medical Center in San Antonio. It was here, amidst the hum of machines and the silent prayers of parents, that the deeply rooted pathologies of her life would curdle into a methodical campaign of murder. The Pediatric Intensive Care Unit at Bexar County Hospital, now University Hospital, was a place of last resort for the sickest children in South Texas. When Genene Jones began working there in 1978, she projected an image of supreme confidence. While many new nurses were intimidated by the high-stakes environment, Genene dove in headfirst. She quickly developed a reputation as a can-do nurse, volunteering for difficult tasks and never shying away from the most critical patients. Her colleagues noted her almost ghoulish fascination with the process of dying and resuscitation. She would pepper doctors with questions about the exact mechanisms of cardiac arrest, the pharmacology of emergency drugs, the subtle signs of a patient crashing. It seemed like professional curiosity, but in retrospect, it was research. It wasn't long before the statistical anomalies began. A baby named Rolando Santos, just 4 weeks old, was admitted for what was believed to be a minor issue. He was stable and responding well to treatment. Then, during Genene Jones's shift, he began bleeding uncontrollably from every puncture site on his body, the IV line in his arm, the heel prick spot from a blood test. His blood had lost its ability to clot. The medical team was baffled. They transfused blood and clotting factors, but it was like pouring water into a sieve. Rolando died a horrific death. An autopsy was inconclusive. It was a medical mystery. The cause of death was listed as complications related to his admitting condition, but it made no sense. What no one knew was that his symptoms were a textbook case of a massive overdose of the anticoagulant heparin, a drug Genene Jones had ready access to. Then there was Rosemary Vega, a 2-year-old, recovering from minor surgery. She was a bright, cheerful child, expected to go home in a day or two. During one of Jones's shifts, Rosemary suddenly had a grand mal seizure and went into cardiac arrest. Genene was the first to sound the alarm, the first to begin chest compressions. The team managed to revive Rosemary, but the lack of oxygen to her brain left her severely and permanently disabled. The event was documented as an unforeseen complication. The list grew. 11-month-old Joshua Sawyer was admitted with smoke inhalation after a house fire. He was recovering well. His breathing had stabilized, and he was playful with the nurses. One afternoon, during Jones's shift, he suffered a catastrophic seizure. Jones was, as always, the first to respond. She administered anti-seizure medication. But Joshua's seizures only worsened. He went into cardiac arrest and could not be revived. Later, it would be alleged that Jones had injected him with a massive overdose of Dilantin, the very drug used to treat seizures. In a smaller dose, it saves lives. In a massive dose, it is lethal. The pattern became terrifyingly clear to a handful of her fellow nurses. A child would be stable. Genene would be seen alone with the child, perhaps adjusting an IV line or administering a medication. Moments later, an alarm would sound. The child would be in full arrest, not breathing. Heart stopped. Genene would then spring into action, the hero of the hour, often successfully resuscitating the child she had just attacked. Sometimes she would fail, and the child would die. Other times the child would survive, but with profound brain damage, and Genene would be praised for her miraculous save. She was playing God, holding the power of life and death in a syringe, and the outcome seemed almost secondary to the thrill of the drama itself. In 1981, Dr. Kathleen Holland, a brilliant and compassionate pediatric specialist from Yale, was hired to run the PICU fellowship program at Bexar County. She was an outsider, not beholden to the hospital's internal politics, and she brought a fresh, analytical perspective. It did not take her long to realize that her unit was in the midst of a silent epidemic. The mortality rate was astronomical, far exceeding national averages. The sheer number of code blue events was inexplicable. These were not children on the verge of death. Many were stable or improving before they suddenly crashed. Dr. Holland began her own quiet investigation. She started by reviewing the charts of every child who had died or suffered a code event in the past year. A chilling pattern emerged from the data. The vast majority of these incidents occurred between 3 p.m. and 11 p.m. She then cross-referenced those times with the nursing schedules. One name appeared over and over again: Genene Jones. Working with a hospital statistician, Dr. Holland confirmed her fears. The analysis revealed that a child in the PICU was up to 25 times more likely to die or suffer a life-threatening emergency when Genene Jones was on duty. The numbers were not just suspicious. They were a mathematical scream for help. Dr. Holland also noticed the bizarre nature of the medical crises. Children were suffering from symptoms that defied their diagnoses. Some experienced sudden muscular paralysis and stopped breathing, while others bled uncontrollably. She began to suspect the children were being injected with powerful drugs, specifically succinylcholine and heparin. Succinylcholine, a paralytic agent used in anesthesia, would perfectly explain the sudden respiratory arrests. Crucially, it metabolizes in the body within minutes, making it virtually undetectable in standard toxicology tests. Heparin, a potent blood thinner, would explain the inexplicable bleeding. It was the perfect murder weapon in a hospital setting. A common drug, easily accessible to a nurse, that mimicked a natural medical catastrophe and left behind little to no forensic evidence. Armed with this devastating statistical and anecdotal evidence, Dr. Holland did what she thought was the only responsible thing to do. She went to the hospital administration. She laid out her findings for the chief of pediatrics, the hospital administrator, and other senior physicians. She presented the charts, the graphs, the undeniable correlation between one nurse and a trail of dead and brain-damaged children. She pleaded with them to take action, to remove Jones from the floor, to call the police. The response she received was not one of concern for patient safety, but of pure, unadulterated fear. Fear of a lawsuit. The administrators were paralyzed by the thought of the scandal. A public revelation that a nurse was murdering children in their hospital would not only lead to massive legal liability, but would also destroy the institution's reputation. Their response was a masterclass in institutional cowardice. They questioned Dr. Holland's methodology. They floated alternative theories. A contaminated water supply, a strange virus, anything to avoid confronting the monstrous truth in front of them. One administrator reportedly told her, "You're going to destroy the pediatric residency program if this gets out." The priority was clear. Protect the hospital, not the children. Their solution was as cynical as it was dangerous. They could not fire Jones based on statistics alone without inviting a wrongful termination lawsuit. So they devised a bureaucratic workaround. They decided to restructure the PICU nursing staff, phasing out all LVNs and making it an all-RN or registered nurse unit. Since Genene Jones was an LVN, this would eliminate her position and force her to leave. It allowed them to get her out of their hospital without ever having to acknowledge the real reason, without ever having to file a report with the police or the Texas Board of Nurse Examiners. In March of 1982, Genene Jones quietly resigned. The hospital administration breathed a collective sigh of relief. But in protecting themselves, they had unleashed a proven predator back into the world, armed with a clean professional record and a license to kill. After leaving Bexar County Hospital, Genene Jones quickly found a new job. In the summer of 1982, she was hired to work in a small private pediatric clinic in the sleepy town of Kerrville, Texas, about an hour northwest of San Antonio. The clinic was run by Dr. Kathleen Holland, a different physician with the same name, a tragic coincidence that would cause much confusion. This new Dr. Holland was unaware of the dark cloud of suspicion that had followed Jones from San Antonio. Jones presented herself as an experienced, highly skilled ICU nurse. Looking for a quieter pace of life, her references, carefully curated and not from the suspicious staff at Bexar, checked out. She was hired on the spot. For a few months, the clinic was quiet. The work consisted of routine checkups, immunizations, and treating colds and ear infections. It lacked the high drama of the ICU, the captive audience of anxious parents and young doctors that Genene craved. But it was only a matter of time before her compulsion to create crisis would resurface. The pattern started again, subtly at first. A child in for a simple vaccination would suddenly have a brief, unexplained seizure. Another would stop breathing for a few seconds before spontaneously recovering. And each time Genene was there, calm and in control, the hero of the moment. Dr. Holland found these incidents puzzling, but attributed them to freak medical anomalies. The event that would finally bring an end to her reign of terror occurred on August 24, 1982. A mother named Petty McClellan brought her 15-month-old daughter, Chelsea, to the clinic for a routine checkup and immunizations. Chelsea was a healthy, vibrant toddler, full of life. Genene Jones prepared the syringes and administered the shots in the examination room. A few minutes later, as Petty was dressing Chelsea to go home, the little girl's eyes rolled back in her head. She went completely limp and stopped breathing. The small clinic erupted into chaos. Dr. Holland rushed in and began emergency resuscitation. True to form, Genene Jones was right in the middle of it, performing CPR, calling for equipment, projecting an air of practiced authority in the face of the crisis she had created. An ambulance was called, and Chelsea was rushed to the nearby Sid Peterson Memorial Hospital. Doctors there managed to restart her heart, but she had been deprived of oxygen for too long. The vibrant little girl had suffered catastrophic, irreversible brain damage. She would live, but as a shadow of her former self, unable to walk or talk, requiring constant care for the rest of her life. This time, however, the circumstances were different. This was not the chaotic, high-tech environment of an ICU, where a dozen factors could be blamed for a child's sudden decline. This was a healthy child, in a small outpatient clinic, who had stopped breathing moments after receiving an injection from one specific nurse. The chain of events was starkly, terrifyingly clear. Dr. Holland, her mind racing, made a crucial, courageous decision. She immediately secured all the vials and syringes in the clinic. She found the vial of the vaccine given to Chelsea and had it tested. It was normal. Then she and her staff began searching for the syringe Jones had used. It was missing. Jones claimed she had disposed of it properly. But in searching the clinic's biohazard disposal containers, investigators made the discovery that would crack the case wide open. Tucked away in the trash was a small box containing vials of succinylcholine, the powerful, fast-acting paralytic agent that Dr. Kathleen Holland of Bexar County had long suspected Jones of using. There was absolutely no medical reason for that drug, a potent anesthetic agent, to be in a private pediatric clinic. Its discovery was the equivalent of finding a high-powered rifle at the scene of a supposed hunting accident. It was the smoking gun. The police were called, and for the first time, Genene Jones was facing a criminal investigation. The discovery of succinylcholine finally brought the full weight of the law down upon Genene Jones. Kerr County District Attorney Ron Sutton began building a case, not just for what happened to Chelsea McClellan, but for the entire dark history that was now bubbling to the surface. He was soon inundated with calls from the nurses and doctors at Bexar County, who, freed from the hospital's culture of silence, came forward to tell their stories. The investigation snowballed from a single assault case into a massive inquiry into potentially dozens of child murders. The forensic challenges were immense. To build murder cases for the Bexar County deaths, prosecutors would need to prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Jones had injected specific children with specific substances. But succinylcholine was untraceable after death. Records were missing, and the hospital, still terrified of liability, was less than cooperative. Investigators did exhume the bodies of several suspected victims, but the technology of the time yielded no definitive proof of the drugs used. Faced with these high hurdles, prosecutors made a shrewd strategic decision. They would first prosecute Jones in Kerrville for the crime they felt they could most definitively prove, the assault on Chelsea McClellan. The charge was injury to a child, a first-degree felony carrying a sentence of up to 99 years. The trial, which began in early 1984, was a media sensation, captivating a horrified nation. The prosecution, led by Ron Sutton, laid out a clear and powerful narrative. They argued that Genene Jones, addicted to the drama of medical emergencies and the praise she received for handling them, had knowingly injected a healthy child with a deadly drug to create a crisis. They presented the damning evidence of the succinylcholine found at the clinic. They brought in medical experts to explain how the drug's effects perfectly matched Chelsea's sudden paralysis and respiratory arrest. The emotional core of their case, however, came from the testimony of other parents from both Kerrville and San Antonio. One after another, they took the stand and told hauntingly similar stories. Their child was stable. Genene Jones was with them, and then, suddenly, they were fighting for their lives. Jones's defense attorneys argued that Chelsea's collapse was the result of a rare, unforeseen reaction to the routine immunizations, a one-in-a-million medical tragedy. They attacked the credibility of the nurses from Bexar County, portraying them as jealous colleagues engaged in a hospital witch hunt. They tried to paint Genene as a caring, competent nurse who was being scapegoated for events beyond her control. Jones herself took the stand, presenting a calm and confident demeanor, flatly denying any wrongdoing. But under cross-examination, her testimony was filled with inconsistencies and a chilling lack of emotion. After a grueling 5-week trial, the case went to the jury. They deliberated for just over 3 hours. On February 15, 1984, they returned with a verdict: guilty. Genene Jones was convicted of injury to a child. The judge, showing no leniency, sentenced her to the maximum possible term, 99 years in state prison. The courtroom, packed with the families of her victims, erupted in a wave of tears and relief. It was a moment of profound, if incomplete, justice. While the 99-year sentence was a victory, it was not a murder conviction. For the families whose children had died, the fight for full accountability was not over. Later that same year, the Bexar County District Attorney's Office moved forward with a murder charge. They chose one of their strongest cases, the 1981 death of 4-week-old Rolando Santos, the infant who had bled to death from a suspected heparin overdose. This trial was even more complex, a battle of medical experts debating the arcane science of blood coagulation. The prosecution had to prove that the infant's death was not the result of a natural disease process, but of a deliberate, malicious act. They methodically presented evidence that Rolando's bleeding was so severe and rapid that it could only have been caused by a massive, externally administered dose of an anticoagulant. They once again established the familiar, damning pattern of Jones's presence just before the fatal crisis. The jury agreed, and Genene Jones was convicted of murder and given a concurrent 60-year sentence. For decades, the story seemed to be over. Genene Jones was inmate number 380,583, destined to live out her days in a Texas prison. But a bizarre quirk in Texas law brought her case roaring back to life. A 1977 statute, passed to alleviate prison overcrowding, mandated the release of inmates once their time served, plus their accrued good time credit equaled the length of their sentence. Because Jones's crimes were committed before this law was repealed in 1987, she was grandfathered in. In a shocking turn of events, it was announced that Genene Jones, the angel of death suspected in up to 60 infant deaths, was scheduled for mandatory automatic release on March 1, 2018. The news sent a shockwave of horror and outrage through Texas and across the country. The families of her victims were forced to confront the unthinkable prospect of seeing their children's killer walk free. But the district attorney in Bexar County, Nico LaHood, refused to let that happen. He assembled a dedicated cold case task force with a single mission: find a way to keep Genene Jones behind bars. They reopened the old files, digging through mountains of hospital records and re-interviewing witnesses whose memories were now more than 3 decades old. Their strategy was to find another case from her time at Bexar County that was strong enough to secure a new murder indictment. A new conviction would carry a new sentence, one not subject to the old mandatory release law. It was a race against time. In May 2017, with less than a year to spare, the task force succeeded. A grand jury indicted Genene Jones for the 1981 murder of 11-month-old Joshua Sawyer, alleging she had injected him with a fatal dose of Dilantin. In the following months, prosecutors built on that momentum, securing 4 more murder indictments for the deaths of Richard "Ricky" Nelson, Rosemary Vega, Patrick Zavala, and Paul Villarreal. The legal net had closed around her again. Faced with the prospect of spending the rest of her life in courtrooms, and now in her late 60s, Jones finally relented. In January of 2020, she entered a plea of guilty to the murder of Joshua Sawyer. In exchange, the other indictments were dropped. She was sentenced to life in prison. The legal loophole was finally sealed. Genene Jones would never be free again. The case of Genene Jones is a horrifying study in the betrayal of trust. But to truly understand its legacy, we must dissect the dual anatomy of her crimes, a rare and terrifying psychological disorder, and a catastrophic systemic failure that enabled it. The psychological driver is widely understood to be Munchausen syndrome by proxy, now clinically known as factitious disorder, imposed on another. This is a mental illness where a caregiver, almost always a woman, deliberately and secretly harms a dependent, usually a child, to satisfy a profound pathological need for attention and sympathy. The perpetrator doesn't seek financial gain. The reward is purely psychological. They create a medical crisis so they can be seen as the heroic, long-suffering caregiver, the one who is calm and competent in the face of tragedy. They are addicted to the drama, the praise from doctors, the admiration of their peers, and the sympathy of the community. Genene Jones is a textbook example. Her entire life was a rehearsal for this role. Her childhood lies, her need to be the center of every story, her fascination with tragedy, it all culminated in the perfect environment of the PICU. Each Code Blue was a scene she scripted, directed, and starred in. She was the problem and the solution, the arsonist and the firefighter. This dynamic gave her the ultimate sense of power and significance, a feeling she had desperately craved her entire life. She wasn't just killing children. She was using their bodies as props in a twisted drama of her own making. However, the psychology of one disturbed individual is only half of this story. The other, equally important part of this case's anatomy is the institutional failure that allowed her to operate with impunity for so long. The administrators at Bexar County Hospital were presented with clear, irrefutable statistical evidence that one of their nurses was a walking disaster area. Their response was not to protect their tiny, helpless patients, but to protect their reputation and their bottom line. They chose to avoid a scandal rather than confront a killer. By quietly pushing her out with a clean record, they prioritized their fear of litigation over their moral and ethical duty to do no harm. That single cowardly decision directly led to the catastrophic injury of Chelsea McClellan and the terrorizing of other families in Kerrville. The system designed to police the medical profession failed at every level. The culture of the 1980s, which often deferred unquestioningly to medical authority and was deeply reluctant to admit to internal problems, created the perfect blind spots for a predator like Jones to exploit. The Genene Jones case became a landmark, forcing hospitals and medical boards across the country to reevaluate their policies. It spurred the development of more robust systems for tracking adverse patient outcomes, for credentialing medical staff, and for mandatory reporting of suspected abuse to law enforcement and state licensing boards. But the fundamental vulnerability she exposed remains a chilling reality. The very foundation of healthcare is built on a sacred trust between patient and caregiver. The true horror of Genene Jones is not just the lives she took, but the trust she poisoned. A chilling reminder that sometimes the monster isn't the one under the bed, but the one standing beside it in a crisp white uniform. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.